Welcome to this event entitled Homes of the Jewish Past, the Story of a Lost Museum. I'm Anita Norwich, and I'm the academic advisor to the Center for Jewish History's Fellowship Program. CJH, as I'm sure you know, contains the archival collections of the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute. Together, these 5 partner institutions constitute the largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. Before we begin, a couple of technical notes. First, you are encouraged to submit questions for the question and answer portion of our programming using the Q&A function that you'll find on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions at any point throughout the program. Please note, though, that the chat function has been disabled. Secondly, the program is being recorded and will be available on the center's website and YouTube channel soon. We will email you the link as soon as it's available. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Jeffrey Shandler is Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University and the current National Endowment for the Humanities Scholar in Residence at the Center for Jewish History. A scholar of modern and contemporary Jewish life, he is the author, editor, or translator of 16 wonderful books, most recently Yiddish, Biography of a Language. Colin Weisser is the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies and the acting director of the Koshinsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University in Toronto. His most recent book is the co-edited volume, Key Concepts in the Study of Anti-Semitism. He's currently finishing a book about the relationship between YIVO co-founder Max Weinreich and Orthodox Yiddish scholar Solomon Birnbaum, and their contrasting responses to the Holocaust and visions for the place of Yiddish in post-World War II Jewish life. And now I turn this over to Jeffrey Shandler.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you all for tuning in today. Before I start my presentation, I have a few more words of thanks. First, to the Center for Jewish History for awarding me this fellowship. It has been just a wonderful opportunity to spend the year doing research and writing at the center. And I extend my thanks to everyone who I've met who works at the center, from the people you meet when you walk in the door, to the folks in the library, to the administrators. They have all provided such wonderful assistance and support. I also want to express special gratitude to the archivist at the YIVO Institute for helping me locate materials for the topic that I'll be talking about today. And while I'm at it, I would like to acknowledge my home institution, Rutgers University, for providing me with research leave so that I could be at the center this year. And last but not least, I'm very appreciative that Kalman Weiser has agreed to be the respondent today. He has been working on the same historical moment that I'm interested in. I've already learned so much from his work, and I look forward to more insights from him today. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen and get down to business. So in January of 1944, a small group of Jewish scholars in New York, most of them recent immigrants and war refugees, announced that they were going to create a museum dedicated to Jewish life in Eastern Europe before World War II. For more than 2 years, they collected materials for the museum from North American Jews, acquiring hundreds of photographs, documents, and other items. But by the end of the 1940s, the project was abandoned. The museum was never opened. This may seem at first glance to have been a quixotic undertaking. The scholars, who were based at the American branch of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, had little in the way of funds or materials for exhibitions. They didn't have adequate space for the museum as they envisioned it, nor museum professionals to work with, nor were they very sure of their constituency in America for this enterprise. This was, in effect, an effort to make a museum from scratch, and to do so in the midst of a war and a catastrophic genocide of European Jewry. Had YIVO succeeded in creating this museum, it would have offered Americans an unprecedented survey of East European Jewish ways of life and of lives that at the time were in the process of being annihilated. Yet even as an unrealized project, the plan to create this museum is noteworthy. It marks an inflection point in the dynamics of encountering East European Jews, as it turned from engaging them as a thriving presence to mourning their destruction and creating their memorialization. The museum project raises a series of questions. Why did YIVO scholars set out to inform American Jews about pre-war East European Jewish life in the form of a museum? Why was this project never realized? And what can we learn from this largely forgotten effort, which took place at a momentous turning point in Jewish history? So first, some background. The YIVO Institute for Jewish Research was founded in 1925 as an independent center for the social science study of Yiddish-speaking Jews in Eastern Europe. The institute was located in Vilna, then part of Poland. Now, of course, this is Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. And here we see the building that YIVO had in Vilna in the 1930s. In the years before the start of World War II, YIVO amassed extensive collections of books, archival documents, cultural artifacts, and works of art. The Institute issued landmark scholarly publications on East European Jewry and on the Yiddish language. YIVO also built an extensive following of supporters among the region's Jewish population, who helped the Institute collect a wealth of ethnographic materials. YIVO's building in Vilna housed several museum collections dedicated to Yiddish theater, as we see here, as well as collections of folklore, pedagogy, and art. Though Eastern Europe was YIVO's base of operation and primary subject of study, the Institute had branch offices in other cities with large populations of Yiddish speakers located in Europe and the Americas. Among the first of these to be established was the American branch, or the Amobtel, as it was called in Yiddish, was founded in New York in 1925, just shortly after the Institute itself had been founded. Shortly after Germany's invasion of Poland in September of 1939, YIVO's American branch became the Institute's provisional central headquarters. At the time, this branch was based in the Manhattan offices of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, known as HIAS. This was their building at the time. Today, this building is home to the Public Theater in the East Village. The Amabtel was run by a small number of scholars who had immigrated to the United States in the years before the start of the war. They were joined by other scholars who arrived as refugees in 1940 or 41. At first, some regarded this as a temporary move for YIVO. They envisioned the Institute would eventually return to Europe, where they would resume their work, though under what would doubtless be very different circumstances. But by 1943, it became clear that this would not be possible. New York would be YIVO's home for the future. That year, YIVO moved out of the HIAS offices and into a building of its own, located in Morningside Heights, near Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia University. Even as they despaired for the murdered people among whom they had lived and worked for years, YIVO scholars began to rethink the Institute's mission. How would they continue to study East European Jewry in a tragically transformed Jewish world? And how would they engage with the American Jews among whom they now lived? One outcome of their efforts to reconceive the Institute's work was a plan to open a museum. Documents drafted in 1943 revealed that the museum was originally called the Museum von Jüdischen Städten, the Museum of the Jewish Town. And it was conceived in conjunction with the plan to create an archive of the records of Landsmannschaften, mutual aid societies that had been organized by immigrants from individual towns in Europe. So they were looking to collect materials such as these. In fact, it may be that the idea of creating the museum was motivated by the desire to establish the archive. YIVO was eager to collect the documents that Landsmannschaften possessed as resources on Jewish life, both in Eastern Europe and among immigrant communities in America. However, it had proved difficult for YIVO to acquire items from these organizations due to, in the Institute's words, the immense mistrust that exists in these societies among Amcho, the Yiddish word for the common folk, with regard to Jewish intellectuals and social activists. Moreover, YIVO noted, members of these organizations had strong emotional attachment to these items, which for them are not materials, but are living symbols of their birthplaces, their families, and their own childhoods. In order to gather materials from these organizations' members, YIVO stated that it would have to appeal to the feelings of these people and impress them with the scope of the planned archive and museum. This undertaking would enable YIVO to gather what it described as the dusty, scattered fragments of Jewish life in America in a central location for the purposes of scholarship. YIVO characterized this project as a museum for posterity devoted to the destroyed Jewish towns of Eastern Europe in its own building, configured like other museums. One planning document notes that New York City already had museums dedicated to what it called old Indian culture and the foundations of Spanish culture in the Americas. These were references to the Museum of the American Indian, founded in 1916, and the Hispanic Society of America, founded in 1904, both of which were at the time located at Audubon Terrace in northern Manhattan. And as you can see from these large Beaux-Arts buildings, YIVO's ambitions for its museum were quite substantial. The organizing principle of the Landsmannschaften, defined by local communities, correlated with the collecting effort for the museum, as well as with plans for how to structure its exhibitions. YIVO wrote that both the museum and the archive would be organized by localities within regions. That is, each town would be a unit, and individual towns would then be grouped regionally. For example, Bessarabia, Podolia, Volhynia, Lithuania, Polesia, Galicia, and so on. The museum would, in effect, reproduce the map of Eastern Europe in terms of its history and geography of Jewish settlement. And as this map indicates, the museum would be structured according to regions per the period before World War I. This arrangement would represent Yiddish-speaking Jewry as a nationality with a defining geographic presence throughout Eastern Europe. In this respect, YIVO's vision for its museum resembled national museums that had been established in Europe from the mid-1800s to the first decades of the 20th century. In January of 1944, YIVO announced to the public the plan to create was now called Der Museum van de Alte Heimen, which was rendered in English as the Museum of the Homes of the Past. Max Weinreich, YIVO's director of research, mentioned the museum in his address to the Institute's annual conference held in New York on January 7th. He characterized this undertaking as a salvage operation, which would provide a place where everything that has been rescued from the old world will be concentrated. Indeed, he argued, our Museum of the Homes of the Past might save more traces of the old traditions of European Jewish life than will be preserved in Europe itself after the current catastrophe. At this time, YIVO distributed a pamphlet describing the project and appealing for donations of materials to the museum. The pamphlet characterized this undertaking as preserving all that was and is the intangible possession of the great masses of Jews of Eastern Europe. The museum would be of great value for all American Jews, the pamphlet explained, especially for those who immigrated from Eastern Europe. Moreover, the museum could have great significance for the education of younger generations of Jews in America who knew too little about the world from which their parents and grandparents had come. The museum could give these young people a more palpable image of Jewish life in Eastern Europe from which they were direct descendants. The museum would also have great value for researchers seeking the undistorted truth about Jews and Jewishness, especially with regard to Eastern Europe. The pamphlet listed the kinds of items YIVO wished to collect for the museum. These were also itemized in the Institute's bilingual newsletter, as in this article here. And what we see are that they are looking for all kinds of photographs. They are looking for lots of paper materials, letters, documents, and publications. They're also seeking ethnographic information, including descriptions of communities, of interesting types of people. They are looking for songs, proverbs, sayings, jokes, local linguistic idioms, and they're also looking for objects connected with traditional Jewish life in the Old World, including ritual items and clothing. The Institute further explained that item labels in the museum's displays would list the names of those who had donated these materials and that all donors will be recognized in YIVO's publications. To bolster its collecting efforts, YIVO invited leaders of Landsmannschaften and other immigrant organizations to help promote the museum project among their members. A YIVO representative also spoke about the project on WEVD, New York's most popular broadcaster of Yiddish radio programming. And the Institute was especially interested in engaging younger American-born Jews through this project, and so it reached out to students in secular Yiddish high schools, inviting them to participate in the efforts to collect materials for the museum. This article, which is about reaching out to students, also appeared in YIVO's newsletter, and alongside is a photograph of Chechel Lunsky, librarian of the renowned Strashun Library in pre-war Vilna. And this photo, as the caption explained, had been donated to YIVO for the museum project. Realizing that some people were reluctant to part with items in their possession that the Institute sought for the museum, YIVO tried to reassure potential donors of the greater value in contributing items to the museum and asserted the importance of doing so as a duty to the Jewish people. In this article, also from the newsletter, the Institute explained, it's easy to recognize the importance of the museum, but it is often not so easy to give up objects that are valuable because they remind one of one's childhood, because they are tied to recollections of those with whom one was close. We understand and value this, but the museum is the only place where these objects will be preserved and not become lost. We will not throw away anything, as often happens in private homes, when moving by accident or because children don't understand their value. We will not let anything go to waste. Moreover, it is a national obligation to give to the museum everything that can have some historical value. This national imperative must be placed higher than personal sentiments. YIVO collected contributions of materials for the Museum of the Homes of the Past during the following 2 to 3 years. In August of 1946, an inventory, of which this is the first page, listed an overview of items that YIVO had received until then for the museum. Over 700 photographs from dozens of different locations, plus collections of folk songs, descriptions of individual towns, letters, and documents, as well as a small number of objects from religious and traditional life. At this time, YIVO published reproductions of some of the photographs that had been donated to the museum in issues of its newsletter, as we saw with the photo of Chechel Lunsky. Here are a few more of these photographs. This is a studio portrait of a woman and her son who lived in Bershad, Podolia, not part of Ukraine, around 1906. Her name is not given, but she is identified as the only Jewish woman to work as a letter carrier in Tsarist Russia. This undated photo depicts peddlers in a courtyard located between Yatkova and Zhidovska streets in Vilna. This was the site of a marketplace specializing in the Jewish trade in secondhand goods. And this is the chicken coop at the Medem Sanatorium, run by the Jewish Labor Bund for poor Jewish children with health problems, and it was photographed in the late 1930s. Starting in 1949, some of the photographs collected for the Museum of the Homes of the Past were also published in New York's Yiddish daily newspaper Der Tag every Sunday, as announced here. They appeared under the heading Images of Jewish Life in the Old World. The newspaper's publication of these weekly sets of images, here's one example, appears to be the last public presentation, albeit an oblique one, of the museum project, which seems to have been shelved permanently around this time. So, why did YIVO never realize the Museum of the Homes of the Past? Well, I've not come across any direct explanation. A number of factors seem possible. First, a pressing concern for the Institute generally at the time was financial. YIVO operated on a modest budget that did not adequately cover the costs of all the projects it wished to pursue. Because of financial constraints in the early post-war years, YIVO's library had to cut back on the number of new books it acquired, and the Institute had to delay the completion of multiple publications, research projects, and exhibitions, sometimes doing so by years. At this time, YIVO had a major new priority regarding its collections, and that was recovering materials that had been looted from Vilna by German forces during the war. After extensive negotiations, these materials arrived in the United States in 1947. And what we see here are YIVO staff examining creates of these materials shortly after their arrival. Concurrently, the Institute began to focus on a new area of research and collecting, what we would now call Holocaust studies. In January of 1947, the Institute opened an exhibition in its headquarters titled Jews in Europe, 1939 to 1946. The exhibition was the largest one that the New York YIVO had ever organized, presenting thousands of individual items. The displays extended throughout the Institute's headquarters, including in its stairwells. In addition to numerous maps, records, and photographs documenting the genocide of European Jewry, the Institute presented some artifacts that had been donated to the Institute by Holocaust survivors who had recently arrived in the United States. What we see here is a section of the exhibition on Poland. The poster that you see on the left says, "Honor the heroes of the uprising," and it marked the second anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Institute had also begun to pursue other endeavors for engaging American Jews, launching research projects on Jewish life in the United States, publishing new scholarship in English as well as in Yiddish, and offering a research training program in Jewish studies to American university programs. In addition to these developments, there was perhaps a more fundamental challenge to realizing YIVO's plan to create the Museum of the Homes of the Past. The Institute's vision for the museum and for understanding Jewish life in Eastern Europe more generally reflected a pre-war sensibility. YIVO conceptualized Jews as a diaspora nationality rooted for centuries in Eastern Europe, whose national language was Yiddish. This model related to Jewish life in pre-war Poland, but it did not speak to Jew circumstances in mid-20th century America. However, if YIVO's vision of the museum was, in this sense, too late, rooted in a pre-war sensibility, it was also, in a different way, too early. The idea for the museum anticipated future efforts to memorialize pre-war East European Jewish life, efforts that began to appear in the United States during the first post-war decades. And these works took shape primarily in print, including photo albums, anthologies, essays, and scholarly studies. Though they were not the work of YIVO, these examples all involved people who had a connection to the Institute. So going from left to right, we begin with Die verschwundene Welt, The Vanished World. This is a photo album that was published by the Forward Association. And among the people who helped with creating this volume were two YIVO librarians, Risha Kligsberg and Mark Zborowski. Next, we have Abraham Joshua Heschel's 1950 book, The Earth is the Lord's. This was based on a lecture he gave at a YIVO conference in 1945. Mark Zborowski, again, was the co-author of Life is with People, a 1952 anthropological study of the shtetl. And then Lucy Davidovich, who compiled the 1967 anthology, The Golden Tradition, had been a student at YIVO in Vilna the year before the start of World War II. She later served as Max Weinreich's secretary in New York, and then helped recover books that had been looted from Vilna by Germans during the war. So in all of these projects, there are these tangential connections to YIVO, though none of them were the work of the YIVO Institute per se. But then in the 1970s, YIVO produced a major contribution of its own to this ongoing endeavor, an exhibition, book, and documentary film, all titled Image Before My Eyes. The exhibition and book, both of which were subtitled A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland, 1864 to 1939, were the work of historian Lucjan Dobrzycki and folklorist Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett. Filmmaker Joshua Walecki created a feature-length documentary based on the exhibition's photographs. Released in 1981, the film complemented the photographs with interviews of an array of Jews who had lived in Poland before World War II. Compared to YIVO's envisioned Museum of the Homes of the Past, Image Before My Eyes, in its different forms, exemplified a new interest in pre-Holocaust Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Image reflected a generational shift in sensibility, which moved from that of YIVO's wartime staff, who had grown up in Eastern Europe, had begun their careers there, to that of a post-war generation of Jews born in North America. For them, the destruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe was not experienced directly as a loss. Instead, engaging with the pre-war past was a discovery made from the distance of time, place, and culture. This generation was enriched both personally and intellectually by vicarious encounters with Jewish life in pre-war Eastern Europe. Whether through listening to family stories or studying Yiddish language and literature, collecting folklore, performing Yiddish folk songs, or researching vintage photographs. Now, it might seem as though the connection that YIVO had endeavored to forge between this bygone way of life and younger American Jews through the Museum of the Homes of the Past was realized at last. But there are telling differences between Image Before My Eyes and YIVO's wartime aspirations for the museum. Image did not seek to document Eastern Europe as the heartland of an enduring Yiddish language nationality in order to provide a cultural foundation for future generations of American Jews. Instead, Image Before My Eyes presented Jewish life in pre-Holocaust Poland as a singular historical moment of dynamic and diverse vitality. This is exemplified by promotional material for the documentary film, which, as you can see on the right, featured a photograph of a group of young actors with the caption, "They are the most appealing, optimistic, idealistic, impassioned people of their time, with everything to live for." This was Jewish Poland, 1930. In addition, by centering photography as a medium, Image Before My Eyes called attention to these pictures, not simply as sources of information about the past, but also as artifacts whose creation, circulation, preservation, and discussion were cultural practices of interest in their own right. So, to conclude, in the trajectory of studying East European Jewry during the past century, YIVO's Museum of the Homes of the Past marks the inflection point between engaging this population as a living culture and encountering it as a bygone era. This population's transformation from a large, thriving presence into an uprooted, devastated fragment of what it had once been was swift and heinous. Nevertheless, YIVO scholars have been able to turn quickly from grieving for the destruction of the people among whom they had lived and for whom they had worked, to seeking ways to memorialize this population and convey the value of their ways of life to a largely estranged American Jewish public. And this is in itself a remarkable achievement, a testament to these scholars' tenacity. They envision the Museum of the Homes of the Past as a public manifestation of their desires to preserve the culture of East European Jewry, which would serve as a resource for American Jews' own future. In the face of widespread dispersal and destruction, YIVO envisioned the museum's comprehensive scope as endowing East European Jewry with the stature of a nation. The museum would provide their past with a new home, endowed with the enduring stability and esteem associated with museums. In its unrealized state, the Museum of the Homes of the Past compounds the loss of East European Jewish lives and ways of living with the loss of this early effort to materialize their remembrance. Yet at the same time, the story of this lost museum endows it with an afterlife that is perhaps more expansive in its potentiality. We might imagine what the museum would have been like had it in fact been opened in the early post-war years. And then we might wonder what would have happened to it over time in response to developing ideas about history museums and about Jewish memory practices. Finally, beyond the particular subject at hand, how does this story inform our understanding of the ways that people respond to catastrophic losses, including by planning museums. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And now I'll just turn it over to Colin Weisser, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that incredibly stimulating talk. I had the opportunity to read a draft, but it's so much more once you see the photos. So I am going to speak for a few minutes with prepared remarks. Jeffrey may want to say something in response, but then I have some questions for him. And hopefully we can have something of a dialogue before we proceed to the question and answer period. Now, reading Jeffrey's paper and seeing the presentation, I was deeply struck, first of all, by his remark that YIVO's vision for a museum of the homes of the past was in one way too late and in another way too early. It was too late as an act of salvage of ethnography and museum creation for the purpose of preserving the heritage of Eastern European Jewry and educating an American-born generation that was largely embarrassed by its origins, at least in YIVO's estimation. It was too early because it would be decades before a segment of American-born Jewry would be ready to appreciate YIVO's mission and choose to make it its own, even if it then understood YIVO's mandate through the prism of a sensibility and experience quite different from that of Eastern European-born generations. Max Weinreich was gifted with prescience as well as tremendous determination, if not an iron will to shape American Jewry. Under his leadership, the American YIVO anticipated the importance of a multidisciplinary social sciences approach to the study of contemporary Jewish life, long before Jewish studies began to find a home in mainstream American academia in the 1960s and 70s. Now, Jeffrey's poignant insight also struck me at a personal level. I remember walking on the Upper East Side while I was a high school student in 1990. I walked by an old mansion on Fifth Avenue with a banner in Yiddish. I knew enough to decipher Tzarek Haim and ventured inside to find an exhibit titled Going Home: How American Jews Invent the Old World, about immigrant Jews who had returned to visit the old country prior to World War II. I was intimidated by the experience of entering the august building and encountering what felt like a different world. But YIVO left an indelible impression upon me, as I am sure it did on many. In retrospect, this spontaneous visit piqued a curiosity in me, as if in fulfillment of Weinreich's prediction that American-born, academically minded youth would eventually turn to YIVO and to Yiddish in order to understand themselves. For Weinreich, it was only a question of time. Only recently did I learn that it was actually Jeffrey Shandler who curated the exhibit along with Jack Kugelmass. Now, as late as 1944, Weinreich hoped that some sort of organized Jewish life would exist in the post-war era in democratic states in Eastern Europe. But it was very much clear by then that Vilna and Eastern Europe no longer existed as the vibrant Jewish centers that YIVO had known. In the unrealized project for a museum of homes of the past, Jeffrey observes what he calls an inflection point in the dynamics of observing Eastern European Jews as YIVO turned from engaging them as a thriving presence to mourning their destruction and creating their memorialization. The moment points to some of the central questions animating YIVO's history since World War II, questions that struck at the core of its identity for years to come. In the 1940s and 50s, YIVO struggled not only with financial deficits, as Jeffrey alluded to, a lack of staff to carry out its ambitious projects, and the colossal practical burden of reclaiming its collections and the emotional weight of the recent genocide of European Jewry. It also wrestled with the question of its own relevance and the feasibility of translating its mission of diasporic Jewish nation building and the pursuit of self-knowledge as a tool for collective survival into the language, literally and figuratively, of a new reality. What was YIVO's purpose to be when a Yiddish-speaking nation no longer existed in Eastern Europe? Who were its constituency and audience in the post-World War II world? Was YIVO to remain a Yiddish-speaking research institute focused on Eastern Europe, if only for the sake of an aging cohort of immigrant working-class Jews with little secular education? Or was it to be an American institution that would appeal to primarily English-speaking generations, university graduates it considered Jewishly ignorant and ambivalent about their own identity as Jews? Or was it to remain a global institution now centered in New York City, but with branches in Western Europe, Latin America, Israel, and everywhere else that Yiddish-speaking immigrants and their descendants were to be found? These questions were the subject of much bitter and painful debate while the pre-World War II Eastern European-born generation still dominated the ranks of YIVO's leadership. Ultimately, YIVO proved to be a pioneer in such areas as Holocaust research and American Jewish history. All the while, it maintained its commitment to Eastern European Jewish history and culture, including to the Yiddish language. For years, YIVO's Max Weinreich Center was virtually the only address for the serious study of Eastern European Jewry in North America and beyond. Of course, the nature of YIVO's commitment and its relationship to its audience changed over time. The case of Image Before My Eyes as an exhibit, a book, a film, to educate Americans, Jewish and non-Jewish, about Eastern European Jewish life vividly demonstrates this change. It was not only a success in mainstream American intellectual culture, receiving rave reviews, for example, in the New York Times. It was also invited to be screened in Krakow, Poland in 1988, as the end of communism was approaching and a new engagement with the Jewish past was beginning in Poland. It would take a few generations before YIVO could firmly become not only a Jewish institute in America, but an American Jewish institution, or perhaps an American Jewish institution with a global reach, one which found broad resonance among a large portion of the children and especially the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Jewish immigrants. But this process of adjustment and reconfiguration, as Jeffrey shows, began as early as during World War II, and it was neither obvious nor was it easy. Now, I'm going to pose a few questions to Jeffrey, and I'm not sure, Jeffrey, maybe you'd like to appear now. I could give you a question and let you respond.
Okay,
I think that's the best way rather than giving you all the questions.
sure.
And of course, if you have any comments about what I said, you're welcome to make them.
Well, I just want to say it's very rich, and especially to think about the larger struggle that the scholars running this institute were facing in the post-war periods, that this is just, one example of the much bigger questions that they were facing about what they were going to be about. So thank you for that.
Yeah, in all of my research, by the way, one of the remarkable things I found, and you didn't mention it, is how much a role you played in the exhibits that YIVO made. There's this direct connection that you have that you might want to elaborate in beyond speaking about this specific instance. So my first question is this. The Museum of Old Homes was not YIVO's first effort at salvage ethnography. After all, as you mentioned, it had a long tradition of Sammlers, of collectors who were charged with researching their shtetls before the anticipated disappearance of traditional Jewish way of life. But beyond the obvious, of course, that genocide gave this project a special impetus, can you elaborate on the ways in which this project was different from YIVO's pre-war work to document disappearing forms of Jewish life and to create a national museum?
It's a great question. And so to some extent, this endeavor, and even earlier in 1942, the first collecting effort they undertook in the New York YIVO was asking people to donate letters that they had from Europe, and they collected thousands of letters. And again, they were saying, you're just going to throw them out, but we're going to keep them, and these can be great resources for scholars. And to a certain extent, this whole effort was a desire to replicate what they had been doing in Europe to build up their collections of physical materials, but also ethnographic information. So one of the things that they did was they had this pamphlet that they published, Was ist eigentlich jüdische Ethnographie? Just what is Jewish ethnography? And they explained to people what it means basically to be like a field worker and go out and collect information as well as material among people and originally about the past. So you want to find the oldest people, you want to find the people furthest removed from big cities because they are the most traditional, right? And that was going to be the focus of collecting in Europe. And that interest evolved over time so that by the mid-1930s, they were interested in the here and now as much as in the past, in urban life as much as in more provincial life. But it was all focused on what was nearby, and that in drawing in collectors, you were also drawing in public support, not primarily financial support. And in fact, that's where the Amabteil, the American division, played its biggest role, was in sending money to help the Institute run in the 1930s. But as a kind of social movement. And they were looking for ways to try and recreate that in the United States. But you know, the challenge, the key challenge was a lack of really understanding American Jews, and having also to get over some of the prejudices they had about American Jews regarding their Jewish cultural literacy. The collecting mission in form was very similar, but the issue of how do we use collecting as a way to build a constituency, that was a greater struggle. And it was because this was a population that they really just didn't quite understand yet.
Yeah, I was very much intrigued also, you know, just especially as I was seeing the photos, I didn't realize how majestic the buildings were for the Museum of the Native American and the Museum of Hispanic Culture until you see it. And so early, from 1916 you mentioned. And, you know, Weinreich was closely affiliated with Edward Sapir, who was, of course, a pioneer in the study of what we call here in Canada First Nations, of Indigenous peoples in North America. And I wanted to know, is there much of a discussion of in what way that specific museum is going to influence this? Because, you know, in around 1916, notions of Native Americans in the United States would not be very advanced by our contemporary standards, right? Our contemporary sensibilities. And to put that model onto a model of Eastern European Jewry, what exactly does that mean in 1944?
That is a really good question. And there is only this one reference in one document where they say, hey, there are already these other museums of what we might call minority cultures in America. Why not us? However, those museums were constituted very differently from what YIVO had in mind. Both of those museums were founded on collections collected by people who were not members of the Latin world, not Native Americans, but were members of the WASP elite who had built these extensive, rich collections of art and artifacts of these respective cultures. And because they were men of means, they essentially created institutions that would house their collections. So this was not what we would call an indigenous grassroots enterprise, which is what YIVO imagined. And I think their thinking was more looking at those buildings from the outside rather than looking at the inside from at least how they were constituted and how those collections were amassed. And so it's really interesting, though, that that was a model for them. And of course, some of them lived in Washington Heights, not far from where these museums were. So they had seen them and impressed them, and I think encouraged them to think big. And I think at a certain point they realized that that's a heavy ticket item to create a museum like that. And I think, you know, the financial factor is one of a number of factors of why this project was never pulled off. But those museums are constituted quite differently in terms of how they were put together, which is an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think I have time for about one more question, and I'd like to reflect on, your own personal experience. As I mentioned, this going home exhibit around 1990 was, important to me, and I was delighted to encounter it in YIVO Yedias, in the news of YIVO, which I've been going through every year for about 80 years. And you really see this evolution of YIVO, at least as it portrayed itself to the outside world. And you're a big figure in it. And what I wanted to understand better is, how did this exhibit compare with the museum's exhibit, in the sense of, one of the things you describe in the Yedias, or Jack Kugelmass, I don't remember which one of you says it, it was very much of the purpose of these people who came from the United States, went back home for a period, in some ways to confirm they might have made the right decision in emigrating. And here you've got, what's the impetus for people to donate now, and what kind of image of Eastern European Jewish life do they want to create by donating? I mean, there's a YIVO narrative, but there's a narrative that I imagine the people donating want to create. What do they have in mind?
There's really good questions about sort of the motive, what brings people to donate materials. And a lot of it is also when they donate. So the Landsmannschaften did not want to donate materials. They were reluctant to do so in the 1940s. By the late 1970s, when YIVO initiated a major Landsmannschaft collecting project, that's when they were able to collect, because this immigrant-based institution of the Landsmannschaft, the members were aging out, and they were downsizing in their homes, or they had passed away and their children were cleaning out their houses, and they were very happy to know there was a repository for materials they had been holding on to for decades. So a lot of it is timing of when things get collected, and what donating to an institution means. That actually has a greater importance than having it for yourself. This was the struggle in the 1940s. And it was actually, I think it's quite presumptuous that YIVO thought that, you could say to people whose relatives might be in the process of being murdered, to say, give that to us. And even though it might be the only materialization you have of people whom you knew and loved who have now been killed, we have a higher purpose. I think most people thought, no, this is a family treasure. But a generation later, there's a change in perspective and in attitude. Just very quickly about the Going Home exhibit, it originated with a graduate seminar that Jack Kugelmass ran. I was really the second banana in this project. It was primarily his, but it was the idea to sort of turn around the narrative, the immigration narrative, which is, it was unilateral. Jews leave Eastern Europe, they come to America. But it turns out a lot of Jews go back, but as visitors, not as settlers. And what does that look like, both in the years between World War I and World War II, but also visits that were post-World War II. And what's key is the exhibition opened just about the time that communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe. And so it comes as in a way as an unwitting marker of a threshold where a whole new relationship between Jewish Eastern Europe and Jews living in the United States and elsewhere have with a place that now you could visit much more easily in the post-communist period. So it's quite interesting to me as, first of all, as a project in its own right, but also as a marker of yet another threshold in this ongoing relationship.
Yeah, I don't know, are we out of time is it time for Q&A now?
I see Anita's back, so.
Yeah, Anita's back.
Did I get back too early?
No.
For everybody to admit it. Okay. I just wanted to, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you both for a really interesting discussion, and to pose some of the questions that, frankly, I and others who have been posting questions have. Of particular interest is this change in time and perspective. And I was struck by the change simply in the title, from the Museum of the Jewish Shtetl to the Museum of Homes of the Past. And how or when that transition happened, I think is interesting. And it's connected, if I may add another one onto this, to a question that comes from one of the audience, which asks, how do you think the plans for homes of the past compare to what you find at the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv? And I should add that this change from shtetl to homes is very similar to the change in that museum in Tel Aviv, which is now no longer called Beit HaTfutzot Diaspora Museum, but rather ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People. So if you could talk a little bit about that transition.
Sure. So
those transitions.
this name, Museum von Jüdischen Shtetl, is it's just on one document. It's, I think, the earliest document that I've found. And I should explain that the records are not comprehensive. This abandoned project, this is often the case with abandoned projects, is people don't save the way they might otherwise do. The shift in name reflects a broadening out of thinking that, after all, not everybody lived in a shtetl, and that if you want to be comprehensive, right, that you have huge populations that were living in major cities, and of course you had small populations that were living in rural areas, but the city life would be as important. And so I think that that expansion is part of it. The other thing that always struck me is it's von die alte Heimen, which is not the usual idiom, is von der alte Heim, singular, right? Which we usually render in English as the old world, sometimes the old country, literally the old home. But here it's plural, the old homes. And I think this is an indication that they want to demonstrate the internal diversity was very important to them. The region, and defined region regionally. And geography really drives this project in a big way. So, I haven't seen, the ANU, I saw, the Diaspora Museum back in the day. So I don't know enough to comment on that, but in both cases, even though there is a shift away from diaspora to peoplehood, that which I think reflects changing attitudes in Israel about how we talk about the diaspora, not as something we repudiate, because A, it's not going away, and B, there's a mutual independency here that is understood as enriching rather than as, that the diaspora should just shrivel up and die. So that I think drives behind a change in agenda, and also, but it's also a different way of how do you position Israel as central. And the old model was the diaspora is going to disappear and you're all going to wind up here, and that the diaspora becomes an artifact of a Jewish past. The current model is we are the keepers of the Jewish story internationally. We are the center. We are the center, not a center, but the center. So it's a different way of negotiating, positioning Israel in relationship to world Jewry as their relationship to world Jewry changes. But that's based on my sense of having read about the new version of the museum. Haven't been there yet, but it's on my to-do list.
Okay. There's a question about what happened to all of the artifacts that were donated.
Yes.
To the YIVO.
I figured that would be actually the first question, because it's when I tell people about the project, that's the first question that they often bring up. And here's what I can tell you. I have a sense of where two large areas of collecting wound up. One is photographs and the other is Landsmannschaft materials. And that is, in both cases, they were folded into larger collections. This is not unusual that as an archive grows, it rethinks how it organizes the material it has. And the history of YIVO's archive includes rethinking how they inventory their very extensive photographic collection. So they collected 700, 800 photographs for this. There are many thousands of photographs of pre-war East European Jewry, as well as photographs of other topics as well. And they're now organized differently. So a lot of it is geographic. Some of it is photographs of famous people are in what's called the personality collection. And for the most part, the provenance of these images as having originally come in for this project was not preserved, which I rather would have liked to know. However, I have some sense of particular images like the ones that were in the newsletter, or some of the ones, they are inventoried with information that they were donated for this project, but mostly not. That also shows shifts in ideas of what information, what metadata, since this is now all digitized, what metadata is relevant. That was not seen as particularly pertinent to documenting these images. And the Landsmannschaft material, as I mentioned before, they had this big collecting project in 79 to 81. And then in 86, I think they published a catalog of this Landsmannschaft archive that folded in earlier donations. And that's where the Landsmannschaft material wound up. But there is no comprehensive record at the item level of what came in for this project or where they went, which would have been really interesting to know.
Yes, it would have been. If I can take the prerogative of, I don't know what this is, the chair, the MC, the whatever, and ask Kalman, I know that you've worked very extensively with the Max Weinreich archive that is actually at the University of Michigan. And I wonder if there's any reference to this museum building or any position that Weinreich himself took about this issue.
I mean, specifically this issue, unfortunately, I looked at my notes. I didn't see anything about it, but that's in part because of, what nature of the collections, right? You can only find what's there. What's in Michigan is a lot of personal letters that Weinreich wrote to family members and colleagues when he didn't see them. So, during when Uriel Weinreich is in the US Army in 1946, they're writing. But Uriel Weinreich, fortunately or unfortunately, is not in the US Army in 1944. And that's when you'd see a discussion of this. So I haven't yet come across an explicit discussion of this. But we know how he felt about this stuff in general. We have a very strong sense of that.
There's a question about whether there were parallel efforts among emigre communities. This person asked specifically about parallel efforts among emigre communities in France in the same era, or one might add, or anywhere else in the same era.
It's a good question. France would be very different because, they're caught up in the war. It would have to be a post-war undertaking. You have Landsmannschaften there. You certainly have memorial efforts, but I think more localized, more private than the idea of the public institution. We should also remember that, in the history of Jewish museums, first one is Vienna, 1895. By the beginning of World War II, or actually by the middle of World War II, every Jewish museum on the European continent has been shut down, its materials appropriated or destroyed, and the Jewish museum scene is at low ebb. There are two in the United States. They're both pretty small. They're not given a lot of attention. And so the turn to museums in the post-war period actually takes time. Part of it is because creating a museum is a heavy lift. And so when you do see Jewish museums open and reopen in Europe, it takes decades until that can happen. It is not the highest priority, where the highest priority is rebuilding a community in situ, if that community is going to stay in situ, because there's a lot of mobility. And at what point people feel the imperative and the necessity of having a public institution dedicated to Jewish culture, to Jewish past, to Jewish art, whatever it might be, which would have a different valence in post-war Europe than it would have in the United States. So this does not happen easily. And it takes a while until we see these institutions be created.
Yeah, I'm gonna just add a note. One of you have to remember, of course, the years we're dealing with, around 44 to 46, and as Jeffrey precisely said, they're just coming out of the war. But one of the interesting things is they're doing an amazing amount of collection of Holocaust-related materials already at this time in places like France. And the other thing that's going on is quite interesting is that YIVO still has active branches in Europe. And YIVO in New York is in constant conversation with Paris and London and elsewhere. I'm actually surprised that they didn't bring them into this conversation in some way about, this museum or commemoration in general in the early years, at least not that I've seen yet. But they're discussing all sorts of things that in ways that seem unthinkable to us today, that they had such a vision that Jewish life would continue, and Yiddish-speaking Jewish life in Western Europe and elsewhere also at this time.
And so they are collecting, as you mentioned, they're in contact, and they are getting, as the war is ending, materials that are being collected by these branches and also by individuals who are sending the materials that are what we would now call Holocaust-related documentation. But the primary motive for collecting generally is for historical documentation and for providing evidence for war crimes trials, later for reparations. So the collecting impetus is not primarily for putting them on public display, but as resources for scholars and as resources for people who are going to be in the courts and dealing with governments. And so but some of the things, for example, that exhibition, Jews in Europe 39 to 46, there's material that was sent to them from France and from Germany that was included in the exhibition. And but primarily they were interested in collecting, and I think this is true of even for the museum project. The museum was, to some extent, a conduit for getting all kinds of materials for scholars. And that's actually not unusual for museums that are attached to research institutes, is that the public is of secondary interest and the scholars are of primary interest. And a lot of what they were collecting you wouldn't put on display, like people's ethnographic accounts. But a scholar would go to town on that. So so that is, I think that's key for understanding this this endeavor.
Thank you. I want to give you, we're getting close to out of time, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to have the last word, and you can duke it out about which of you gets the last word.
Kalman, you go first.
Okay. If you want, you're not obligated to.
I wasn't prepared to say a last word, but for me, having intensely studied the history of YIVO in its early decades in America, and by now I'm thinking about in the 80s and 90s. First of all, it is staggering how much was achieved, but the internal changes are also staggering. It's really, we're talking about the Weinreich era. What Jeffrey's talking about is this, notion of Eastern European Jewish Jewry is a national entity, and the problem with American Jewry is it's not a national entity. And it needs to be convinced that it should be something like a national entity. And these attitudes endure to a great extent until, Weinreich dies in 1969. And even though he steps down as the research director in 1952, his hand is still there. He's still very much present. But in the 1970s, we see really a very clear changing in YIVO. There are new endeavors by the 60s. A number of prominent figures like Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett is very clearly felt. But it's almost like YIVO, the new stage in YIVO is starting in the 70s and then in the 80s. And it's really, and you see this, all this stuff is there already in this incident that Jeffrey is talking about. But it was completely unpredictable how it would play itself out. So it's an amazing perspective we have 80 years later about this, about these visions and the competition and what YIVO has become today was hardly clear in 1946. And this is, to me, just staggering.
So my last word is, first of all, I want to thank Kalman because he's already given me so much to think about. And I will say this is not the last word I'll be having with him of our shared intellectual interest. And but I will say, you know, this point of this moment, which I find staggering, that as everything you have lived for and worked for is destroyed in this horrible way. And they don't just throw up their hands in despair, they start to explore multiple ways, of which this is just one. And this one doesn't play out as envisioned, but others do. And how they simply do not give up on a foundational commitment to the purpose of Wissenschaft, of scholarship. And, you know, in 1943, there's this talk, and it's 43, you know, a terrible year. And Weinreich says in one of his speeches, he said, Wissenschaft is Wissenwirtschaft, research, knowledge that creates. And to talk about being creative at this moment, that is such remarkable tenacity. And you know, it's for me, it's truly, truly inspiring. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. And I am going to take another word to say that what is striking about what both of you have said and about this entire project is that it was not merely, although it was also a memorial to what had been, but a plan for the future, that the future would need this material. And I think the two of you have certainly helped us see why and how that material has been needed. So on behalf of the Center for Jewish History, I thank you both very, very much. And we hope we'll see you at the next program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.